My name wasn't on the group chat. Not the one my mother made for the dinner reservation. Not the one my aunt shared the restaurant photos in. Not even in the caption of the candid my cousin posted of my sister standing in the middle of everyone she loved, holding a glass of Prosecco and beaming like she'd just won something she'd earned alone. She had won something. I just happened to be the one who built it for her. 3 weeks after that dinner, I was sitting in a window seat somewhere over the Atlantic, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, my phone on airplane mode, and a man beside me who had never once asked me to be smaller. I wore an emerald dress I hadn't worn in 2 years. I'd left my laptop at home for the first time in longer than I could remember, and I posted one photo from the coast of Portugal cliffs, light, the dress with a caption that said nothing dramatic. It didn't have to. By the time we landed back in the States, my sister's career had started asking questions she couldn't answer. But this isn't a story about watching someone fall. It's about learning, slowly and painfully, how to stand. I was 8 years old the first time I understood that my sister and I were not the same kind of child. It was a Tuesday afternoon in our parents' house in Columbus, and my sister had come home from a school art show with a blue ribbon. She was 6. She'd painted a dog, uneven and sweet, the way 6-year-olds do. My mother framed it that same night, hung it in the hallway with a gold thumbtack and stood back like she was in a gallery. I had won the regional spelling bee 2 weeks earlier. The certificate was on the kitchen counter, under a stack of mail. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I kept telling myself that for the next 22 years. My sister grew up soft and certain. She had the kind of personality that made adults lean toward her at dinner tables, that made teachers speak gently, that made our parents rearrange their schedules around her feelings, like they were made of something fragile and precious. I grew up around her. Practical, steady, the one who knew where the extra batteries were, and how to file for a fee waiver, and what to do when the landlord stopped responding. My parents called it strength. They said it like it was a compliment. I didn't understand until much later that what they meant was, we knew you could handle it without us. I put myself through design school on scholarships and part-time work. My sister got her tuition covered and spent her junior year studying abroad in Copenhagen. I didn't say anything. I got a job at a branding firm in Chicago. I worked long hours and learned fast, and built a reputation for the kind of work that made clients feel seen. I was good at it. I liked it. I sent my sister money when she needed to cover a gap between freelance gigs. I proofread her proposals. I gave her feedback on her portfolio at midnight because she had a submission due, and she texted me instead of sleeping. 2 years ago, she asked me for help. Not a small ask. Her first real client, a restaurant group looking for a full rebrand, had hired her on the strength of a mood board she'd shown them, but she had no idea how to execute it. She was panicking. I told her I'd help her through it. What I didn't realize was that help would mean designing the entire identity logo, color system, typography, brand guidelines, menu layout, the whole architecture of how the restaurant would present itself to the world. I did it over 6 weekends. She paid me in gratitude, and a bottle of wine she never actually sent. The client loved it. Word spread. My sister got 2 more clients from that first job, then 3 more after that. She landed a position at a boutique agency in New York. She built a name for herself, and I watched it happen with genuine pride, the kind you can only feel for someone you love. I just didn't know she had never mentioned my name. Not once. Not to the restaurant group. Not in her portfolio. Not in the agency interview where she showed the rebrand as a solo project and got the job on the strength of it. I found out by accident. A creative director I'd been hoping to impress reached out to compliment me on the restaurant work. He'd seen it circulating in a branding forum. He said it was some of the strongest identity work he'd seen from someone at my level, and he was surprised I hadn't submitted it to any awards programs. I thanked him and said nothing, and then sat in my car in the parking garage outside my office and stared at the steering wheel for 11 minutes. She had presented it as hers. Not as a collaboration, not as something she'd directed and I'd executed. Hers. I called my sister that night. She said she'd always meant to credit me, that it was a transitional period, that everyone does things like this when they're starting out. She cried a little. She apologized in that way where the apology is mostly about her discomfort rather than the harm. I told her I understood. I told myself I'd let it go. Then came October. My sister got promoted at the agency, senior brand strategist, at 27. My parents drove to New York from Columbus to take her to dinner at a restaurant in the West Village. My aunts sent congratulations videos. My cousin flew in from Atlanta. My uncle, who had not attended my graduate thesis presentation despite being 40 minutes away, posted a photo from the table with the caption, "So proud of our girl." I found out from Instagram. No one called. No one texted. My mother, who had spoken to me the Sunday before, had not mentioned the trip. I sat with that for a long time. Not with rage, not with drama, just with the quiet and accumulating weight of understanding something you've actually known for years, but kept excusing. My friend Becca came over that night. She brought Thai food and sat across from me on my living room floor with her shoes still on and said, "Tell me everything." I told her about the dinner, the Instagram post, the uncredited work, all of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The thing about being invisible is that people assume you're fine with it. You made it so easy for them." She wasn't wrong. I had made it easy. I'd never made a scene. I'd never asked for anything I wasn't willing to give myself. I'd been the kind of person who holds the door open so long she forgets she was also trying to walk through it. Marcus texted me that night. He'd been away at a conference in Seattle, and something in my message I'd sent him a short update. Deliberately calm must have read as less calm than I intended, because he called instead of texting back. I told him about the dinner, about the work, about the slow, familiar pattern of being the load-bearing wall in a house where everyone else got to be the decor. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "When I get back Friday, I want to take you somewhere." I said, "Where?" He said, "Somewhere you can breathe." I said, "Okay." He came back on Friday. On Saturday morning, he showed me a photo on his phone, a cliffside town in Portugal. White and gold and green, the Atlantic glittering below it like something that didn't know how to hold still. He'd been planning it for weeks, he said, before I even called. He'd seen something shifting in me over months, the late nights, the way I held my shoulders, the way I said "I'm fine" in a tone that meant the opposite. He'd booked it as a reason to give me before I needed one. I stood in my kitchen in my socks and looked at the photo for a long time. Becca came with me to my apartment the day before we left. She reached into a tote bag and pulled out something folded in tissue paper, an emerald-wrapped dress, structured and bold, the kind of thing that took up a room without trying. She'd found it at a designer resale shop months ago, she said, and held onto it for when I was ready. I asked her what ready meant. She said, "Ready to take up space. You'll know." We flew out of O'Hare on a Tuesday morning, business class, Marcus carrying a canvas bag and a biography of someone I'd never heard of. I brought work. He took the folder out of my carry-on while I was getting coffee and left it in the overhead bin without saying a word. I looked at him. He shrugged. He said, "You're not going to need it." Lisbon was everything I hadn't realized I was hungry for. The light there is different, heavier, more golden, the kind that makes everything look like it's been kept safe rather than just left outside. Our apartment was small and white, with blue tiles in the kitchen and a window that opened onto a narrow street full of the sound of church bells and trams, and people who seemed to have decided that afternoon was a perfectly good time for a long lunch. I slept without setting an alarm for the first time in 2 years. On our second day, we took a bus to Sintra. I wore the emerald dress. No particular reason. I'd pulled it out that morning and put it on because it felt like the right choice, not because I was making a statement, not because I was thinking about anyone in Columbus or New York, but because it was there and so was I, and it felt like something. We walked up through the village to a viewpoint at the top of the hill. The Atlantic spread out below us, enormous and indifferent in the way that only large things can be, not cruel, just honest about its own scale. Marcus took a photo of me standing there, back to the camera, the dress moving slightly in the wind, the sea stretching out to the horizon. I posted it that evening without overthinking it. The caption was something I'd been circling for months without realizing it. Some people build their legacy on someone else's foundation. I chose to build my own. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't explain. I closed the app and went to dinner. We ate at a small place near the waterfront that had no menu, just whatever they'd caught that day. And we stayed at the table for 3 hours talking about nothing urgent. Marcus reached across the table at one point and said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "Would you want to build something together? Not just a trip, I mean actually build something." I looked at him. He said, "I'm not talking about a proposal. I'm talking about a studio. Your name. Your work. A real home for what you actually do." I had thought about that for years, the idea of my own practice, my own terms. But I'd always found a reason to wait. The timing wasn't right. I needed more experience. I didn't have the capital. I was still figuring out who I was professionally. What I hadn't said, not even to myself, was that I had been afraid. That starting something under my own name meant no longer being able to hide behind someone else's structure. That it meant being fully visible, which meant being fully accountable, which meant there was nowhere to disappear to if things went wrong. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Yes." We didn't toast it. He just smiled, the slow kind, the one that meant he'd been waiting for a while. Back in the apartment that night, I picked up my phone. The photo had traveled farther than I expected. Friends from college, old colleagues, people I'd lost track of years ago were commenting. Nothing unusual until I saw a name I recognized from a different context. The creative director who'd reached out about the restaurant rebrand. He'd seen the photo. He'd left a comment that said simply, "Love this. The work and the woman behind it both deserve more visibility. Reach out when you're back." And then, a direct message from someone I'd never spoken to. The founder of the restaurant group. The original client. She said she'd been following me for a while. That she'd always felt strange about the work her agency had delivered, that it felt too cohesive, too assured for what she'd been told was a young freelancer's first major project. She'd seen the post. She'd put some things together. She asked if I'd be willing to talk. I read the message twice, then I handed my phone to Marcus. He read it. He set it down carefully. He said, "You didn't mean to start anything, did you?" I said, "No." He said, "But it started anyway." I didn't respond to either message that night. I sat on the small balcony with a glass of wine and watched the city lights settle into their reflections in the harbor. Something had been set in motion, not by malice, not by calculation, just by the simple fact of being visible in a way I'd avoided for years. I couldn't control where it went. I wasn't sure I wanted to. What I knew was this. I had been the foundation of something that got built without my name on it. And the foundation had finally said, "Here I am." I flew home on a Sunday. On Monday morning, I sent the restaurant founder a reply. We scheduled a call for Wednesday. On Tuesday, I heard from Becca. She said my sister had been calling mutual friends, trying to find out if I'd been talking to anyone about the rebrand. She didn't say my sister was panicking, she said my sister was recalibrating, which was Becca's way of saying the same thing more charitably. The agency in New York was apparently asking some questions about her portfolio. Nothing formal. Just questions. On Wednesday, I spoke with the restaurant founder. Her name was Dana. She was direct and warm and asked me, without dancing around it, whether I was the primary designer on the project her group had hired my sister's firm to oversee. I told her the truth. I told her the whole truth, without editorializing, without positioning it as damage to my sister, without anything except accuracy. I told her what I'd contributed and what credit I'd never been given. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew. I suspected. The quality of the initial work and the quality of everything the agency delivered after never quite matched. I didn't push it because I didn't want to make trouble, but I've been uncomfortable about it." She asked if I'd be interested in working directly with her on the second restaurant they were opening. A new concept, a full identity build, my name on everything. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I signed the lease on a studio space in Wicker Park 3 weeks later. Small, clean, north-facing windows, a long walnut work table I'd been looking at for 6 months. I called it Rowe Studio. Simple. Mine. My sister called me the night before the studio's official opening. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Because I'd learned by then that avoiding something doesn't make it finished. It just makes you tired. She didn't ask how I was doing. She said, I heard you're working with Dana's group directly. I said, yes. She said, you went around me. I waited a moment before answering. Then I said, you built your career around my work, and didn't tell me. I didn't go around you. You built a road on my land and forgot to mention it. She got quiet. Then she said, I was going to credit you eventually. I said, eventually was always a moving target with you. She said, you don't know how hard it's been for me to establish myself. I said, I do actually. I know exactly how hard it is to establish yourself. I just had to do it while also establishing you. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. When she did, her voice was smaller. She said, I'm sorry. And this time it sounded less like a reflex and more like something she actually meant. I didn't rush to forgive her. I didn't rush to close the space between us. I just said, I know, and I let that sit without filling it. The agency placed her on a performance review. Nothing dramatic, they weren't pursuing anything formally, but the questions about her portfolio had surfaced inconsistencies they wanted to understand. I don't know exactly what happened inside those meetings. I didn't ask. Whatever the consequences were, she'd built the conditions for them herself. I hadn't gone to anyone with an agenda. I'd just stopped being invisible. My mother called me 2 weeks after that. I hadn't spoken to her since before Lisbon. She said she'd seen my studio announcement online, that she was proud of me, that she'd always known I was talented. I didn't say anything unkind. I also didn't say, where were you when I needed you to know it? Some things you carry as information rather than ammunition. You don't use it to wound, you use it to stop making the same mistake twice. I told her I'd call her again soon. I meant it. Rowe Studios' first client project ran for 4 months. Dana's new restaurant, a rooftop concept in the West Loop, needed everything: identity, signage, menu design, environmental graphics, the whole language of a place. I worked harder than I had in years, but it was a different kind of hard. Not the kind that asks you to disappear into someone else's vision, the kind that asks you to fully show up inside your own. The project won a regional design award 6 months after opening. My name was on the plaque, just mine. I went to the award ceremony in a navy suit, hair up, no jewelry except the small gold ring I'd bought myself the week I signed the studio lease. Marcus was there. Becca was there. The creative director who'd first recognized my work was there, and we talked for 40 minutes at the edge of the room about what it means to spend years being good at something in silence before the silence gets tired of holding you. I didn't post about the award that night. I didn't need to. I held the small trophy, looked at my own name engraved below the project title, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, maybe not since I was 8 years old, standing in a doorway with charcoal on my fingers, waiting to be seen. I didn't wait this time. I just was. The weekend after the ceremony, I drove to Columbus. I sat in my parents' kitchen and drank coffee from the same mugs they've had since I was in middle school, and looked at the hallway wall where my sister's dog painting still hung in its gold thumbtacked frame. My spelling bee certificate was long gone. I wasn't angry about that anymore. I just noted it, the way you note something that tells you where you came from. My mother made eggs. My father asked about the studio. He was proud in the careful, understated way he'd always been, not the kind that led anywhere, but real nonetheless. We didn't talk about my sister. Not directly. We talked around the edges of everything until we found the middle ground, which was just being in the same room without either of us needing it to be more than it was. That was something. Smaller than what I'd spent years hoping for, but honest. I could work with honest. On the drive back to Chicago, I thought about what Becca had said the night she came over with Thai food. The thing about being invisible is that people assume you're fine with it. You made it so easy for them. I had made it easy. I'd believed that being capable and quiet and never asking for anything was a kind of virtue that the people who loved me would notice and reward it without being asked. They didn't. They couldn't. People can only respond to what they can see, and I'd spent most of my life making sure they couldn't see me clearly. The emerald dress was still hanging in my closet. I thought about it sometimes not as a symbol, not as anything grand, but as the first thing I'd chosen in a long time purely because it felt true. Take up space. Becca had said it like it was simple. Maybe it was that simple. Maybe the whole work of healing is just that, choosing, one day at a time, to be the kind of person who takes up the space she actually occupies. I opened the studio on a Tuesday. I hired my first employee, a junior designer named Mara, who had twice the talent and half the confidence I'd had at her age, on a Thursday. I told her on her first day, "Your name goes on your work, always. I will never let that be negotiable here." She looked a little surprised. Then she said, "Thank you," like I'd given her something she hadn't realized she could ask for. I knew the feeling. Somewhere in New York, my sister was navigating whatever she was navigating. I hoped she found her way through it, not because I wanted anything from her, not even an apology I could accept cleanly, but because I didn't want to carry her failures the way I'd once carried her work. I'd put that down. It wasn't mine to hold anymore. There's a version of this story where I end up angry, where I spend years cataloging what I was owed and what was taken and the precise cost of every sacrifice I made for people who didn't notice. I lived in that version for a while. It was a small, airless room. There's another version where I forgive everything and welcome everyone back with open arms and call it growth. That version is a lie we tell to make the story easier to receive. The version I'm actually living in is more quiet than either of those. It looks like a studio with north-facing windows and a junior designer who knows her name will be on her work. It looks like a man who took a folder out of my carry-on and left it behind because he knew I didn't need it. It looks like a photo on a cliff in Portugal, an emerald dress in the wind, a caption that wasn't addressed to anyone in particular and said everything I needed to say. My sister emailed me last month. No subject line. It said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the foundation. I think I knew, even back then, what I was doing. I just didn't have the language for it yet. I'm not asking you to understand that. I just didn't want you to think I was completely unaware." I read it 3 times. I didn't reply right away. I sat with it for a few days, the way you sit with something when you're deciding what it means to you rather than what it means in general. Then I wrote back. I said, "I believe you. I also believe that knowing something at a low level and choosing not to surface it is still a choice. I'm not ready for things to be the way they were, but I'm not interested in making you the villain of my story either. That job takes too much out of me." She responded with one line. "That's the most you thing you've ever said to me." I almost laughed. She wasn't wrong. I don't know what happens next between us. I don't know if my family will ever fully understand what the years of being the invisible one cost me, or if my mother will ever look at me the way she looked at that dog painting, with uncomplicated delight, like there was nothing complicated to manage, and no calculation to make. I used to need that. I don't need it the way I used to. What I know is this. I built something. Under my own name, in my own space, on foundations I laid myself. The work I do now carries my signature. The clients I serve know exactly who they're working with. The people in my life, the real ones, the ones who see me fully, they showed up without being asked and they stayed without conditions. That's not everything, but it's enough to stand on. And standing on it, I finally stopped waiting to be invited into the room. I understood, maybe for the first time, that I had always had the tools to build one. If you've ever been the person holding everyone else together while wondering if anyone was holding you, I made this for you. Not as a revenge story, not as an instruction manual, just as proof that the quiet ones don't always stay quiet. And that when we finally speak in captions, in contracts, in the language of work that carries our name, sometimes the truth turns out to be exactly loud enough.